Fitting its status as a pop cultural juggernaut, Harry Potter has had its share of big rivalries with other franchises, Twilight, Star Wars, and Lord of the Rings being some of the most famous. But maybe the most direct competition was with Percy Jackson and the Olympians, the other big middle grade turned YA book series about a boy who discovers a secret magical world and fights evil with the power of friendship. That said, Percy always seemed to live in Harry's shadow, and when you look at their film adaptations, it really wasn't a contest at all. Like, even as a dumb kid who didn't think critically about movies at all, I knew these things were trash. But I really loved the PJO books. I liked Potter too, but I would've gone to Camp Half-Blood over Hogwarts pretty much any day. That said, while I was a PJO fan, I was never a super fan. I didn't read any of Rick Riordan's other work besides like the first 3 Heroes of Olympus books, I barely engaged with the online fandom, and I kind of drifted away from the series once I aged out of its target demo. While I still had positive memories of the series, I wasn't sure if the story would really hold up if I went back to it now. From a distance, Percy looked like he might be the Sonic to Harry's Mario, a genuine competitor at one point in time that still has a loyal fanbase, but also a clear derivative with neither the inventive vision nor the rock-solid consistency that can make a true multi-generational icon. Then the Disney Plus show came along, and unlike the earlier movies that unfortunately existed, it actually seemed to be in pretty good hands. I was feeling nostalgic, and Harry Potter is, you know, less inviting than ever now, so it was really the perfect time to return to Percy Jackson. So I watched the show, and I revisited sections of the books, and I'm happy to say this is some really strong storytelling. If I have to describe the show especially in just one phrase, it's substance over style. The fight scenes mostly aren't super riveting, not all of the effects and performances are amazing, and some of the scene-by-scene pacing leaves something to be desired. But the overall writing behind the world, characters, and mystery provides some satisfying and compelling rumination on family and authority that can appeal to all ages, and in my opinion, it paints a more cohesive picture than its great rival at Hogwarts. For this video, I'll be mainly comparing the first installment of each series, and especially the screen adaptations, but I might touch on later installments here and there. Let's start with the world building. I feel like in modern geek culture discourse, that word often gets used when talking about whether the fantastical elements make logical sense within the fictional world at large, and in Harry Potter that's obviously a disaster. There are so many things that are really easy to make fun of, from OP items like time turners to wizards not knowing what a gun is to Quidditch having like the worst scoring system ever designed, but really, I don't think those things matter all that much. The collective annoyance of jaded nerds complaining about the wizard economy is never going to match the collective joy of excitable kids reading about this secret magical school and imagining what it would be like to go there themselves. And it's not like Percy Jackson is perfect in this department either. That world at least has an explanation for how and why the mythic world stays hidden, while Harry Potter is extremely vague on that subject, but there are still plenty of holes if you look for them. Like, off the top of my head, where are all the adult demigods? The later books suggest most of them get killed by monsters, but if it's so dangerous for them, why don't they just hang out around camp? There's a force field. They don't need to stay in the cabins, but couldn't they build a village? Seems like there's room. I don't know, maybe Dionysus kicks them out when they hit their 20s, wouldn't be out of character. Like I said though, I think that's beside the point. I think there are 2 main purposes of world building for a story like this. First, to create fun scenarios for our characters, and second, to provide a through line that can drive the core conflict of the story. Both Harry Potter and Percy Jackson do that first part well. We get to see every corner of Hogwarts, from magical classrooms to secret vaults to inappropriately flirty bathroom ghosts. And in PJO, we get to see what these figures from Greek myth are up to in modern America, from the abandoned water park holding evidence of a divine affair to Medusa living alone in a statue emporium. Harry Potter does have a leg up when it comes to presentation, but we'll get to that later. When it comes to creating a world with a grand narrative baked in, that's where PJO really shines. The series, being based on Greek myth, involves a huge variety of creatures, but most of the main characters are demigods. To be a demigod is to be born with amazing talents, but also to be thrown into a dangerous world just as you're starting to grow up. It's to be defined by a parent who you almost never see. The footprints of the gods are everywhere, and aren't always flattering, but the gods themselves, even your own godly parent, seem impossibly distant. When they do show up, they almost never give you the answers you wanted. This relationship between the gods and their children bleeds through all of Percy Jackson's storytelling. The one god who most Half-Bloods do interact with is a crass, lazy idiot who's only there out of obligation. The monsters encountered by the heroes are often of the gods' making, which the gods don't do well to be reminded of even when their children's lives are on the line. The wider conflict of the series comes about from demigods feeling dissatisfied by their parents and wanting anything else to fill that void, even if it comes from the literal void underneath hell. I'll talk about this more when I get to the characters, but for now, let's loop back to Harry Potter. In that world, there is a recurring theme of authority figures being complacent and unable or unwilling to recognize danger, forcing our young heroes to break the rules by taking matters into their own hands. This is embodied first with the Hogwarts teachers and later by the Ministry of Magic. This paradigm is quite significant and quite consistent across the series, but it's not uniquely suited to its fantasy world in the same way as PJO's gods being absentee parents and that being the source of a lot of that world's problems. In Harry Potter, we also eventually learn that Snape and Dumbledore were secret puppet masters for Team Good all along, which kind of fights this idea of championing self-reliance. Another, perhaps more concrete source of conflict in the Potterverse is the prejudice against Muggle-born wizards, and Voldemort wanting purebloods to rule over Muggle-borns and Muggles. This is a decent hook by itself, but the only major Muggle-born character is Hermione, and at least for me, that part of her character is really easy to forget. And as for the actual Muggles, the wizarding world, especially Hogwarts, is so isolated from the Muggle world that you can sometimes forget normal people exist. The only Muggles we do get to know, the Dursleys, are abusive assholes. All of this doesn't mean the threat of Voldemort's conquest is impossible to get invested in, but it's easier when his ideology has a personal connection to the main characters. And speaking of that, the core characters in PJO are wonderful, and represent multiple distinct perspectives on the gods. Percy himself is kind of an audience surrogate, especially early on, which is to be expected in kids' fantasy media like this. But through him, we get to see what life is like for the archetypical demigod, the unusual perception of the world, the threat of monsters, and the toll his father's absence takes on both Percy and his mother. And Percy isn't just an archetypical demigod, he's a forbidden child, which means he's affected by the politics of Mount Olympus more than anyone. Perhaps because of this, Percy is very opposed to the rules of the gods, and the prophecy only amplifies the stress he's feeling. And throughout the first season, he's able to channel this opposition into a pretty wide range of emotions. He starts off scared and confused. He's the kind of guy who would just walk into Medusa's house for the promise of answers. After he and his friends defeat Medusa, he grows brazenly rebellious, sending her head back to her creator. Then, at the Arch, he realizes the consequences. By the time he gets to Hephaestus's chair, he seems defeatist, giving in and sacrificing himself without looking for a way around the problem. Then, after he's restored and realizes the rules of the gods can be manipulated, he once again becomes defiant, and his standing up to Zeus acts as a catalyst for Poseidon's surrender. That's a lot of growth for one season, and it affects other characters in important ways. Annabeth comes from a very different background than Percy. She doesn't have a loving mortal family, and she's known to see people like chess pieces. To her, it's not the gods who are defined by selfishness, it's everyone. On the Olympians themselves, she has a more tempered and respectful outlook than Percy, but it's still clear that she's deeply conflicted. You can see this especially in the scenes with Medusa, a monster of her mother's creation. At this time, she's also developing a genuine bond with Percy. They both realize that they literally kill for one another, and this brings them closer together. Once she does encounter a god in the flesh with Percy bound in his machine, she does stand up to him, even claiming that some people don't and shouldn't engage in the Olympians' worst offenses. In that moment, I can feel Percy's influence within Annabeth, but at the same time, she's still not Percy. Her speech to Hephaestus still has an element of flattery, and she's still a long way from just going up to Olympus and telling Zeus how much his family sucks, like Percy eventually does against her judgment. This is how you write characters that are growing closer together but are still their own people. As for Grover, I was never a huge fan of him in the books, and that doesn't really change here. His search for Pan definitely does have some strong real-world subtext, but it isn't fleshed out in this first season very much. For now, he kind of works as a voice of reason and third character for Annabeth and Percy to bounce off of, but overall, I don't find him to be that memorable. He's also not as funny as I remember him being in the books. I know this is sacrilege, but movie Grover was at least more memorable. At least so far. I'm excited to see Show Grover's Cyclops shenanigans next season. Now, Luke, on the other hand. Okay, big spoilers from here on out. Luke is one of the best villains in any youth-oriented fantasy story I know of. If you ask me, he belongs in the conversation with Zuko. He's the counselor of Hermes' cabin, which includes the unclaimed kids. All of those demigods who are even more lost than the rest of their kind, they see him as a mentor. It's apparent that Luke genuinely cares about these kids, and he sees their struggles, more than their own parents do. He knows this, and he's completely opposed to the gods, but there's nothing he can do about it. The gods are simply far more powerful than he is. In his rebellion, he turns to the Titans, the only beings who both hate all the gods and have the strength to actually challenge them. For me, part of what makes Luke so memorable is that his emotional outlook is so similar to Percy's. He just finds himself in different circumstances. Like, imagine if Hades kept Percy's mother, or if Poseidon refused to call off the war for his sake. Could you see Percy going down Luke's road? I certainly could. It's easy to see that being the case if Percy wasn't a forbidden child, if he was just one of Poseidon's dozens of demigod offspring. Poseidon might not have seen his sacrifice as all that special. That's what it's like for most demigods. I mean, look at the Arch scene. Poseidon might have rescued his kid, but Athena had just opened up her sanctuary and left her own kid to die. That's what makes so many of these demigods willing to join Luke. The truth about his character is such a satisfying endpoint to this story, and that's just the beginning of what's in store for him. Now let's go back to Hogwarts, and honestly I feel bad making this comparison, not just because I think the main PJO characters have more depth, but also because I haven't really taken a ton of time to unpack the Harry Potter characters. So feel free to give your own takes in the comments, but for me at least, there doesn't seem to be much to unpack. Harry is an audience surrogate like Percy, but at least in the early books, he really isn't much more than that. He's curious, just as any kid would be at a magic school, and he's brave, just like every other adventure story protagonist ever. Harry also has important family history, but he has less personal stake in that. Ron is just Grover, but less competent and less distinct from Harry. Hermione is more distinct, being a perfectionist who's more stuck up about the rules, but her defining trait of being book smart is leaned on for exposition more than anything else. Overall, I can't find as many interesting dynamics between these characters as I can for those in Percy Jackson. Harry Potter does have a colorful supporting cast, but the only ones who really get the spotlight in that first book and movie are the ones involved in the central mystery. So let's talk about that. The first few Harry Potter books and films are mysteries in terms of plot structure, and the very first is understandably simple. What's Fluffy protecting, who's trying to steal it, and what do they want with it? The execution is mostly pretty solid for what the story is. The stakes are revealed to be increasingly higher, the characters discover more clues throughout the second and third act, but rather notably, I don't see any real evidence of Quirrell's villainy until the big reveal. We know he has beef with Snape, but that's really vague, and I guess Hermione breaks his spell after bumping into him at the Quidditch match, but that might be too easy to miss, especially in a story for children. We also get to know literally nothing about Quirrell's motivation or personal history, which makes the mystery feel unresolved, and it's a huge contrast from what we learn about Luke. If you ask me, PJO also does a better job providing clues about the true villain. Early on at camp, we learn about Luke's attitude toward the gods, establishing him as someone who might actually want to start a war between them. At this time though, it's still buried underneath a friendly demeanor, so most viewers, especially young viewers in the show's target audience, won't immediately suspect him. Once the quest starts, the identity of the Lightning Thief is kind of put on the back burner, but that's okay when there's more focus on episodic monster slaying. Once the heroes reach the underworld, we get a massive clue. The sneakers, the ones Luke gave Percy, flying straight into Tartarus, just as Grover barely manages to pull them off. This is the ideal clue for a story like this. It provides a tense moment, it draws attention to itself, but the connection is enough episodes or chapters behind the viewer that it won't be obvious to everyone. The kids who do figure it out will immediately feel like geniuses. I did not figure it out on my first reading, but once the big reveal came around, I was like, damn, it all fits together now. I felt like I was rewarded for following the story up to that point, and that is a sure sign of good plotting. So yeah, the overall storytelling in the books and show are great, but the show as a whole isn't great, it's just decent. Because yeah, like I said, the show is substance over style, and the lack of style really does hurt the experience. It is quite unusual in that regard. Style over substance is the cliche, it's what we expect from so many big studios. But I do think the Percy Jackson show has the opposite problem. The characters and story arcs are well conceived, but the adventure isn't presented in the most fun or engaging way. This is most egregious when it comes to the fight scenes. Some of them are okay, like the Minotaur and the Chimera, but some of them are genuinely bad. The Furies and the literal God of War will just stand around as the heroes walk up to them and exploit their weaknesses. And while I did praise its role in the plot, the visual and sound design of the Tartarus scene was also very underwhelming to me. In the book, it felt both ominous and intense, really nailing its intent to make us scared of Kronos by describing this deep voice pulling Percy into the dark. In the show, it's this pit in broad daylight, it doesn't actively pull them in, and we don't get to hear Kronos' voice, which, why not? You have a Kronos voice, he talks in this show! And if you're gonna go with that sandy pit design, how cool would it be for Kronos to cause an earthquake that makes the sand start falling in and almost bring the heroes down with him? In the end, a lot of scenes like this feel like they're over too quickly and don't create the tension they should. Beyond being simply less fun in the moment, these aspects can damage investment in the show's storytelling. It's harder to worry about the gods leaving the heroes vulnerable to monstrous threats when those threats often feel artificial and even downright pathetic, and it's harder to buy the gods as these untouchable forces when Ares seems to fight like a total chump. I was gonna chalk issues like this up to budget, but apparently this show costed $12 to $15 million an episode? That's about as much as The Mandalorian, which looks way better. I'm not the most knowledgeable about stuff like this, but I struggle to see where the money might have gone other than the producers' pockets. It's not like every show, or even every fantasy show, needs to look extravagant, but this is an epic journey full of sword fights against monsters to stop war between the gods. If you're gonna make a pretty direct adaptation, it does call for some visual gravitas, which we just don't get in this show. And there are some other stylistic issues that don't tie as closely to budget. The books were actually pretty funny, and I don't remember laughing when watching the show. This isn't to say the books are perfect, I honestly think they got too goofy at some points, and a lot of the jokes might not land for older readers, but the show went too far in the other direction if you ask me. They dropped some really obvious things, like Grover eating metal cans and bleeding like a goat, which would have given him some welcome quirk. Although, I don't know, maybe Thor Love and Thunder made Disney never want to attempt goat-based humor again. Would for me too, honestly. On a dramatic level, the show does bring some effective changes, like Percy spending more time with Luke at the beginning, and Athena letting monsters into her sanctuary after getting offended, and it's disappointing that it has to come with the trade-off of having a somewhat bland visual style and tone. By comparison, the world of Harry Potter is much more richly presented in both the books and the movies. The first movie is kind of generically shot, but the set design and John Williams' music more than make up for it. Every corridor of Hogwarts we get to see is wonderfully realized and bleeds fantastical escapism. Even in the books, the school was described with such incredible flavor. It felt like it had so much life to it, and this is helped by a more stationary plot structure. Most of the Harry Potter series takes place at Hogwarts, and this gives so much more opportunity to flesh the place out compared to Camp Half-Blood, which we only see at the beginning and end of each book. There's a lot of time spent just vibing around the school. Things like the Quidditch scenes don't always develop a larger narrative with the highest efficiency possible, but the way they're portrayed is so fun that you just want to be there. All the sensory details, like the magical winged ball and the cheering crowd and the wind through Harry's hair as he zips through the sky, it can just make you forget about your entire current life. Much less the fact that the game is a pay-to-win disaster with safety concerns that make base jumping look like croquet. The series does an amazing job selling the fantasy of Hogwarts being both a place full of magical thrills and a place you could get used to living at. It's arguable that the greatest asset of a story like this is to spark the imagination of its audience, and that's what Harry Potter excels at. So, in the end, is Percy Jackson better than Harry Potter? That really depends on what you're looking for. Both meant a lot to me as a kid, and I continue to admire both on an artistic level, but I admire them for very different reasons. And if nothing else, revisiting PJO reveals it as a shining example of how stories can take very clear inspiration from others but still offer something worthwhile and unique. PJO is indebted to Harry Potter, Riordan admits as such, but it's also indebted to Greek mythology. These tales of heroes and gods have spawned even more derivatives, video games, novels, movies, musicals, and yet PJO manages to completely stand on its own with its own strengths and weaknesses. The character of Percy Jackson is distinct from Homer's Odysseus, just as he's also distinct from the boy who lived. And this should not come as a surprise. The role of fantastical heroes, both ancient and modern in origin, is constantly changing, and being told and retold in new ways is what allows for these archetypes to become truly immortal. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.